So, Chapter 6, we're going to talk about implantation of the embryo into the endometrial lining. So, when we talk about implantation, implantation is happening at the blastocyst stage, and it's going to happen at this into the uterine lining. So, if we just take a look at the zones of the uterine lining, so the very top of the slide here is the lumen or the inside of the uterus, and then at the very bottom is the muscle layer, and then the outside of the uterus. So if we go from go from sort of outside to inside, we have the myometrium, which is the smooth muscle layer of the uterus. And we see we've got quite a few large uterine arteries. And then as we get into the endometrial lining, we have the innermost lining called the middle compacta. And within that middle compacta, we see very, very deep uterine glands. And then these uterine glands produce fluid. It produces things like glycogen, and it sort of lubricates the interior of the uterus. And in the we also have an extensive network of what are called spiral and straight arteries. So these are branches of these deeper uterine arteries that go and perfuse the more superficial layer of the outer compacta. Okay? And within that outer compacta includes, on the very outside is the surface epithelium of the endometrium, and an incredibly dense network of capillaries, okay, superficially in the endometrium. So implantation is going to happen in three major steps. So we've got this blastocyst, and the first thing it needs to do is hatch out of the zona pellucida. Okay? And then once it hatches out of the zona pellucida, it has to adhere to the epithelium in the endometrial surface. Okay? And this tends to happen around the early luteal phase of the ovarian cycle. Then as once the blastocyst adheres, you're going to start to see erosion of that epithelial lining, and the blastocyst is going to start to burrow into the lining. Okay? And as that blastocyst starts to burrow in, starts to implant, the endometrial tissue is actually going to undergo some significant physiological changes. Okay? And these changes are absolutely important for a successful implantation. And there's really a narrow window of receptivity for implantation with regards to the endometrial receptivity. It involves the estrogen and progesterone that is released during that luteal phase. Those hormones, estrogen and progesterone, really increase the expression of adhesion molecules on the surface of the epithelium, which enhances adhesion of the blastocyst and the burrowing that's part of that, that's needed for implantation. So what we see here in A is we see our little blastocyst that's fairly early in its development. We have that inner cell layer and inner cell mass, and we've got that hypoblast that has just formed. And we have our trophoblast tissue that surrounds it. Okay. So by about 5 or 6 days after fertilization, the blastocyst arrives in the uterus, and it's going to start to rest on that endometrial lining. It usually attaches to the anterior or posterior wall of the upper part of the uterus, but really it can attach anywhere. The trophoblast cells attach to the extracellular matrix proteins of the uterine lining, okay? And it starts to secrete these protease enzymes that degrade protein and start to burrow into the endometrial lining. Okay? Now, these trophoblast cells are highly invasive. And as you can see over here, the trophoblast cells that are invading the endometrium are actually also differentiating into new trophoblast-derived cells, these syncytotrophoblast cells. Okay, they're highly invasive cells, and they are just eating their way through that endometrial lining. And you can see here they're just burrowing in and eating their way through. Sometimes you can have slight bleeding that happens as a caused by this sort of burrowing into the endometrial lining, and that slight bleeding can sometimes be mistaken for a period, or can mistakenly make the woman think that she's in fact not pregnant. As this process continues, where the embryo is burrowing deeper and deeper, these trophoblast cells have now actually formed another cell type. So there's these syncytotrophoblast cells that are burrowing and extending into the endometrium. And then we've got the cytotrophoblast cells that have remained attached to the embryo. Okay? And if you notice, those cytotrophoblast cells are forming those ridges I was referring to in the previous chapter. And those ridges are going to form these primitive chorionic villi that will eventually form the mature chorionic villi, which is the fetal portion of the placenta. Okay. So these syncytotrophoblast cells very soon surround the entire embryo. Okay? At some stage, they're going to surround the entire embryo, and they're going to invade all of this endometrial tissue. And if you've noticed, as they're doing that, they're actually starting to encounter some of these maternal blood vessels, these small vessels, these capillaries, and they're just eating away at the lining of those vessels, and they're leaving behind these little islands of maternal blood, okay? These little lakes or lacunae of maternal blood. Now, those little islands of maternal blood are not encapsulated by a vessel wall anymore. Okay? They are just entirely uncapsulated, but they're surrounded by these syncytotrophoblastic cells. So these little lakes of maternal blood eventually are going to be surrounding these chorionic villi. Okay? And it's really going to lay the foundation for what we will see in the placenta, the relationship between these chorionic villi that are just surrounded by maternal blood. Okay? So by about day 10 to 12 after fertilization, the embryo is going to be just completely embedded in the endometrium. Okay? Now, as that embryo burrows into the endometrium, okay, they are going to induce a change in these, what we call stromal cells, which are just sort of the parenchyme or the tissue of the endometrium. These syncytotrophoblastic cells are inducing this incredibly important change in these stromal cells of the endometrium. They are turning them into what we call decidual cells. And decidual cells are really, or the decidua, is really just the name that we give the endometrial lining of mom while she's pregnant. Okay? So decidual cells are basically the pregnant version of endometrial cells, and the decidua is really the pregnant version of the endometrium. And the decidua is also another thing. The decidua is also the maternal side of the placenta. Okay? So really, as this embryo starts to burrow, and you can see that it continues to develop, right? It continues to develop as it's implanting and burrowing. It's the trophoblastic cells that are differentiating, are doing the work of invading the endometrium, and it's really starting to transform the maternal tissue and the fetal tissue into the primitive placenta. Now, part of this transformation of these endometrial cells into the decidual cells is that the newly formed decidual cells actually start to release what's called interleukin 2. So interleukin 2 is an antibody that once these decidual cells form, right, and that process is called the decidual reaction. Once those decidual cells are formed, they start to release interleukin 2. And what that cytokine does is it actually masks or hides this embryo from maternal immune system. So the interleukin 2 that's being released by these decidual cells, these pregnant endometrial cells, is going to prevent the maternal immune system from being able to recognize this the presence of this embryo. Okay? Because remember, this embryo is only possesses half of mom's genes, right? And so it's only really half mom. The other half is coming from dad. So without that immune masking, this embryo would be identified as a foreign body and potentially be attacked by the immune system. So that decidual reaction is really critical for preventing that. So some more really cool pictures. So we have this embryo, and you see the layer of trophoblast cells surrounding it, and it's resting on the endometrium. And you see in blue here, you see these syncytotrophoblast cells that are extending out of the trophoblast layer and just burrowing into that endometrium. And you can see here it's sort of gotten half of the way submerged, right? It's about half of the way submerged. And it's going to get all of the way submerged. So our next topic, actually, in the next chapter is going to be talking about the development of the placenta, because part of implantation is obviously anchoring, very well anchoring this growing embryo and fetus into where it's going to stay for the next 9 months or so. Okay? And that's within the endometrial lining. So it's going to burrow into the endometrium very, very deeply. Okay? It's going to burrow very, very deeply. And it's going to form the placenta. That's the next major step, is that it's going to form the placenta. And when we look at the contact between the embryo and the uterus, what we see is, as this is getting mature, so we see it very early, but then we also see it as the baby gets bigger and the placenta gets more fully developed. What we start to see are different layers. Okay? So there are these this tissue that was trophoblast in origin that surrounds the embryo, okay? And between that tissue and the embryo is the amniotic sac and fluid. And then we see this attachment point to the rest of the uterus, where we have basically what's up against the part that's up against the wall of the uterus is something called the Decidua Basalis. Okay? The tissue that's surrounding the embryo that was trophoblast in origin is described as the chorionic sac, or the chorion. Okay? So the tissue that surrounds the baby is the chorion. And if we look at, so this is in A, we're starting very, very early. And then B, this baby has gotten a little bit older. And you start to see that the placenta is more elaborated. And what we start to see is not just the Decidua Basalis, which is the maternal portion of the placenta, but we also see chorionic villi, okay, and basically space, intervillous space in between. Okay? And you can see that even more clearly in the later fetal stages. Okay, we see a decidua, a chorionic plate, chorionic villi, and intervillous space. Okay. And so in the next chapter, we're going to look at placental development and look at a mature placenta.